First and foremost, the most obvious development is that U.S. President Joe Biden has made a trip to Kiev in the middle of an air raid, no less. And it's difficult to find a more focused announcement of American policy about what its long-term impressions are and commitments are to the Ukrainian cause than, sending the big guy himself. He's on a trip to Europe, and this was his first stop. Second, over the weekend, Vice President Kamala Harris specifically and very concisely accused the Russian government of crimes against humanity. Now, that is a term that the U.S. government does not trot out on a regular basis. The word genocide may have lost a little bit of its meaning because it's been overused in the last couple of decades, but crimes against humanity are the kind of thing that you only accuse a government of if you will never, ever, ever, ever let them back into the family of nations. So from the American point of view, diplomatically, strategically, economically, financially, all of it, this is now the status of our relations with the Russians. This is a fight until they are gone. And by they, I mean this government specifically. If the Putin government is ultimately replaced by something else, there will be a conversation about what next steps are, but there is not going to be a diplomatic solution to this at any tier. Honestly, it's not too hard to see why. We knew back in April of last year that there were at least 70 different torture camps throughout the Ukrainian space. We found about half that many just in the territories that have been liberated so far in the war, but well over half the territory that the Russians have occupied since the beginning are still under Russian control. So this is going to get ugly before it gets better, but the Americans have made it very clear where their line is, and the line is on the other side of Vladimir Putin. But the most significant development came from Secretary of State Tony Blinken, who over the weekend made it very clear from American intelligence publicly that the Chinese are very seriously considering giving lethal aid and ammunition and equipment to the Russians. Now, we have seen over the course of the last year that American intelligence has gotten very, very good at signals intercept, especially in the Russian space. I suspect there's some good information on the Chinese space, but if I was a betting man, I'd guess that the information that Blinken was referring to is coming from the Russian side of things, because that's where most of the monitoring is going on. We're also in a general meltdown in relations with the Chinese. So the foreign ministry rep, Yang, who was in Munich for the security conference, which is where Blinken made this statement, was publicly saying, right up until he met with Blinken, that the balloon incident was absurd, and of course it was a weather balloon. Blinken has the hardware in hand. I mean, there's no doubting that it was an espionage attempt, but the degree of just organizational breakdown within the Chinese government has reached the very top, and they're incapable of making cohesive decisions and implementing them across their entire system. So if we're having a system that is driven entirely by propaganda, and the propaganda is just quite literally batshit crazy, it's not that the United States is upping the ante here and pushing for a more hostile relationship. It's that the Chinese are now incapable of being a good faith actor, and we're seeing a degree of disintegration across the decision-making apparatus. And it appears, at least from the American point of view, that that is now going into strategic fields with assistance to the Russians on hand. As Senator Lindsey Graham put it in that charming South Carolina way he has, if you jump on the Putin train now, you're dumber than dirt. And we're definitely seeing dumber than dirt break out across the entire Chinese apparatus. Now, if this happens, hasn't happened yet, but if this happens, there will be strict American sanctions on the Chinese system, and I would bet that the very first step is going to involve financial sanctions with sharply limited access to the US dollar. For all the talk out there about the US dollar going away, the Chinese are by far the most enthusiastic users of the US dollar. They massively print currency to the tune of, it used to be 2 to 5 times what we did. We're actually reducing our money supply as part of our economic recovery. The Chinese have sped it up because they no longer have consumption because their population's in collapse. And so the Chinese have no use for their own currency. They try to get US hard dollars wherever they can for everything. So if you restrict that access, it does a number of things, and it really depends on how the Americans do it, but it's definitely going to restrict their ability to move money around the world. That is going to make it very, very hard for Chinese firms to access food, which is all denominated in US dollars, oil, which is all denominated in US dollars, and the US market, which obviously is all denominated in US dollars and is by far, far, far the single largest customer that the Chinese system has. And there is no way that that can happen without some degree of blowback, either indirectly or directly by the CCP, for foreign companies operating in China. And so we are now nearing the break point. And I've been warning folks that if you have assets that you wanted to sell in China, you probably ran out of time about a year ago. And I've been warning that now was the time to get your people out, but we may have now passed that too. Now we're at the point where you might still be able to get some of your operating cash out, but you really shouldn't count on that anymore. And if I'm being perfectly blunt here, folks, we should have seen this coming. The crackdowns in Hong Kong, the genocide in Xinjiang, the slide into full, not authoritarianism, but dictatorship, the Trump trade war, the Biden codification of the trade war, the fact that the only IP theft that was more extreme than what the Chinese did every day on cyber is what they actually did in foreign facilities in China itself. No one should be caught surprised by the disintegration of this relationship. But trade, if you can believe it or not, with the Chinese, at least in terms of exports from China to the United States, are at an all-time high. So people have chosen to ignore the writing on the wall over and over and over. And we are getting very close now to the point where this just ends. There are going to be any number of ramifications of what will happen if the Chinese really go down this path, and it looks like they probably are. But a complete reordering of how global economic works is just the tip of the iceberg.
Any conflict with the Russians was always going to be heavy on numbers, and the Ukrainians simply don't have the population in order to face down the Russians man for man. So they need to inflict massively out of whack casualty ratios on the folks in the fight. If you're not talking 2 to 3 to 1 that we've seen so far, like 8 to 10 to 1 is really kind of the minimum if they are going to walk away from this. The Russians see this war as a battle for their existential survival. They're right, they're not going to stop. And so the only way for Ukraine to emerge victorious is to kill so many Russian soldiers so quickly that the Russian front collapses and the military system within the Russian Federation requires years to recover. We are nowhere close to that. And the only way that the Ukrainians could pull that off is if they can outmaneuver the Russians, and that requires fields that are not mud. This has allowed the Russians to play to their strengths and just throw body after body after body into a few battles, most notably the Battle of Bakhmut, which until now, the main effort has been led by the Wagner Group for internal political reasons, but honestly, the internal political reasons don't matter. As long as the Ukrainians can't maneuver, and as long as the Russians have superior numbers, it's just an issue of throwing wave after wave of humans at them until the weather changes to a degree, logistics shifts to a degree that the battles can move elsewhere. That's unlikely to happen until May. Now, Wagner has been using almost exclusively convicts in their human wave tactics, and as to the number of people that have been lost, the estimates are in the process of being revised by everyone, because everyone is always changing these sort of things during the war. They're starting to use more radio intercepts to guess how many Russians have been killed. The problem is if you go with just visual confirmation, you're going to wildly undercount, because it doesn't count people who are injured, who then were taken away from the front and then died, because the Russians' triage system and medical system is beyond atrocious. And so probably for every person that is visually killed, there's another half to a person that then wandered away and died. Anyway, we now know that the minimum deaths in the war so far on the Russian side is 120,000. The estimates for Russian deaths in the Battle of Bakhmut specifically are somewhere between 10 and 40,000, just for one little strategically insignificant town. Anyway, for the next couple of months, this is just where we are. It's probably too late in the season at this point to hope for a really hard freeze. So we're going to have to wait for things to dry out in May before the Ukrainians might be able to move. By the time we get to May, the Russians will really move a lot more troops into the front. They started the war with somewhere between 100 and 150,000. Today, they probably have about 250,000. With the second mobilization already underway, we're probably going to be around 600,000 to 700,000 by the time we get to May and June. Now, they will be badly supplied, and they will have poor morale and badly trained, and you need more troops like that. Russia. There is nothing about the conflict to this point that is atypical in Russian history. They rarely win on quality. They almost always win on numbers. And we're almost to the point where we're going to see just how well these new infusions of NATO equipment help the Ukrainians on the front line, and just how many massive waves and assaults the Russians can sustain at the same time. And this is going to put the battle in a bit of a pickle for the Ukrainians, because they're going to be facing 2-3 major assaults from the Russians at different points of contact. And if they allow themselves to get bogged down deflecting each and every one of those, they're going to lose. They need to free this up into a war of movement and allow their tanks and their artillery and the rockets to do an offensive in a place where the Russians either can't resist or can't maneuver to counter them. So by the time we get to May, we are going to be in a very fluid strategic environment, most likely with the Ukrainians just kind of backing off, putting the minimum forces they can in this or that front just to slow the Russians down. Will they try to do lightning strikes, blitzkrieg style assault on some other point in the front in order to try to get behind the Russian formations, cut them off from logistical supply and just dust them up? So it's a strategy, considering the numbers of people and the volume of equipment that Ukrainians control. It's really the only game that's in town at this point. This is still, always has been, Russia's war to the moves. We see a strategic logjam break one way or another.